In Ireland, actually, you get what we call the fire and brimstone preachers. And you get the fellow in the pulpit, and he's saying, I will tell you about the great judgment day. I will tell you on that day, the great book will be opened, and all your sins will be on that book. And the Lord will banish the wicked, and there will be a great weeping and a gnashing of teeth. There's an old woman down the front, she says, I don't have any teeth. I said, teeth will be provided.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Woodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 40, and today we're going to look at an amusing saying attributed to Jesus, the hoax, the joke, and the story. We heard at the beginning there an interesting little clip of the Irish comedian Dave Allen from the 1970s. I suppose I was always familiar with him because my parents were fans of his and they often had his programme on the television. His humour was often directed at religion and at his Irish upbringing. What I want to do in this podcast is to take a little look at the joke that he tells there, or at least the origins of it and the history of it, and in particular to focus on one really interesting occurrence of it, where it's actually attributed to Jesus. More of that in a moment. Let's just get to the background of the actual business itself, of the actual story in the Bible, first of all, before we do anything else. That phrase, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth, does occur in the Synoptic Gospels. It's a special favourite of Matthew. It comes 6 times in his Gospel, usually with the phrase, the darkness, and on a couple of occasions in chapter 13, with talking about the fiery furnace. And it does come once in Luke's Gospel in chapter 13, and people like me who think that Luke is familiar with Matthew would say, it's a sign of Luke taking over some of that characteristic terminology that you see in Matthew. In fact, one of the things that you notice about that language of weeping and gnashing of teeth is that it fits into the discussion of judgment and hell that it's very common in Matthew's Gospel. In fact, you might say that Matthew has more about hell and judgment and so on than all the other canonical Gospels put together. But that's the background to the phrase. What about this interesting extra little piece? Well, my colleague Bart Ehrman, in his book Lost Christianities, and then also fellow Dookie Stephen Carlson in his book The Gospel Hoax, tell a fascinating story, which I wasn't aware of before, about a scholar from Princeton who in 1950 published an article about a hitherto unknown saying of Jesus. And the hitherto unknown saying of Jesus is exactly this one that we've just heard, about teeth will be provided. Let me give you a little bit more detail. The article was written by a certain Paul Coleman-Norton. Coleman-Norton was an associate professor of Latin at Princeton University, and his article was called An Amusing Agraphon. An agraphon is a saying of Jesus that doesn't occur written down in the Gospels. And in the article, Coleman-Norton tells about how he came across this previously unknown saying of Jesus in a group of homilies on Matthew's Gospel. Well, it was just a fragment from them, and it was a fragment that he found in Greek in amongst a whole bunch of Arabic materials when he was in Morocco during the Second World War. It's an extraordinary story. And anyway, when you get to this particular bit of Greek, Coleman-Norton tells about how at Matthew 24:51, which features the aforementioned weeping and gnashing of teeth, you get this extra passage, and this is how it goes. And behold, a certain one of his disciples standing by said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, being interpreted, Master, how can these things be, if they be toothless? And Jesus answered and said, Thou of little faith, trouble not thyself. If haply there will be lacking any, teeth will be provided. And so we have, according to Coleman-Norton, this Princeton professor, a witness to a text in which Jesus himself used this humorous line. The thing is, though, Coleman-Norton's story of this discovery of this text, in spite of the fact it's published with great erudition in a peer-reviewed journal, is actually a hoax. How can we tell that it's a hoax? Well, one of Coleman-Norton's students, the late Bruce Metzger, himself later a professor at Princeton, could remember Coleman-Norton telling this joke in the 1930s prior to that alleged discovery. In other words, Coleman-Norton himself had already been telling the joke before he supposedly discovered this manuscript, this fragment in Greek in which Jesus tells the joke. What must have happened is Coleman-Norton has forged this this text as a kind of an elaborate hoax. And I must admit, it's probably the best kind of hoax because it's really there not to earn money or anything else, but just to be kind of funny. And there are little jokes buried in the text which will make sense to Greek speakers as well. Now, the story doesn't quite end there, because although we can be pretty sure that Coleman-Norton perpetuated that hoax, he himself didn't invent the story, didn't invent the joke. He must have heard it from someone else. And we know this because there are multiple examples of the joke occurring really in at least the 50-year period leading up to the time when Coleman-Norton's telling it. The earliest example I can find, and I've been digging around and looking for examples of it, the earliest example I can find actually goes back as far as 1885. You find it in a journal called Our Corner, which was edited by a certain Annie Besant, and it was published in London, and the Anecdotes section of that has what's recognisably the same story with the same pronouncement at the end, but different characters in the main version. Have a listen to it, and you'll see what's different and what's similar. It goes like this. A Presbyterian minister admonishing free-thinking Dr. Russell, the late editor of the Scotsman, warned him to flee from the wrath to come, from the place where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, and painted the joys of heaven, where ransomed sinners chant a new song unto the Lamb. But what will they do with me, queried Dr. Russell, who have neither a voice to sing with nor teeth to gnash? Doctor, doctor, answered the minister solemnly, the teeth will be provided. Now, not only do you get examples of it in British journals from the late 19th century, but you then get lots of examples of it cropping up in American literature, popular literature from the early 20th century. And you can see the characters changing again as you look at the American versions of it. The dominant version has, now in the lingo of the time, a coloured evangelist giving the sermon, and the person that makes the remark about not having any teeth is an old coloured woman in the back of a tent, and it's in a southern town, and you can see the kind of revivalist ideas, the revivalist imagery that's going on here. And so it's easy to imagine Coleman-Norton having heard this joke and then appropriating it for himself and ultimately making it part of his own forgery. The joke these days doesn't get heard so much, and I wonder whether in part that's to do with the fact that there have been such improvements in dental hygiene and so a diminishing number of the toothless. But nevertheless, it's still a story that raises a smile. Perhaps, in most of our cases, not a toothless smile, but a smile nevertheless. Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. I'll be along again soon with another episode. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. Oh, don't forget my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/ntpod, or follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/ntpod. Thanks for all your feedback, thanks for listening, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Bye-bye.